Hello everybody and welcome back. So in the previous lectures we saw that our thinking is predictably irrational in certain contexts, and we also saw why that is the case. Now in this lecture we're going to talk about what this irrationality leads to, how all of these biases lead to domains of irrationality. In this lecture we'll talk about irrationality in action. And the first domain of irrationality I'd like to discuss with you is the domain of superstition. Now, superstition is very much the product of the fact that we're seeing all kinds of relations, all kinds of patterns, all kinds of causal relations that in fact aren't there. And this, remember, is the consequence of error management. Natural selection wanted to make sure that we didn't miss any important causal connections in our environment, such as the eating of a poisonous food and being sick because of it. And in order to make sure we don't miss any causal connections, well, it kind of provided us with a psychological mechanism to be very attuned to all possible connections, to all possible causal relations, all possible patterns. And as a consequence, we see many causal relations, we see many patterns that in fact aren't there. Think about certain days like Friday the 13th and having or experiencing bad luck, or seeing of black cats and bad luck, or walking under ladders and bad luck. But also think about making a connection between the wrinkles in the palms of our hands and our future, or making a connection with the position of the stars at the day or the moment of our birth and our character and also of our future. These are all kinds of connections that really aren't there, but because we're so attuned to try to perceive and to find causal connections, well, we're making connections that we shouldn't be making. And so superstition, horoscopes, palm reading, all of that stuff is very much a byproduct of this process of error management that endowed us with an overperception of patterns and causal relations. It has existed for a very long time and probably will keep existing because of that very precise reason. And even if there is a correlation, that correlation is not always causal. And we have a tendency to interpret correlations as causal relations. As the saying goes, correlation does not imply causation. And a good example of this occurred at an Israeli Air Force base. Now, the instructor discovered the following. When a student performed an exercise exceptionally well, he would compliment the student. But in the next exercise, that student often would perform more poorly, wouldn't perform as well as in the first exercise. Conversely, after a student did an exercise pretty poorly, he would get mad and, inflict some kind of punishment, gave them some kind of extra chores, perhaps have them do push-ups or something. And he would see that very often, typically, that student in the next round of exercise, he would do better. So he concluded that positive reinforcement doesn't work, only negative reinforcement works. So you shouldn't give compliments when they do something well, you should only punish them when they do something poorly. And he thought that was interesting, since in psychology and the pedagogical sciences, they typically thought the opposite was true, that positive reinforcement worked better than negative reinforcement. So he contacted psychologists to communicate his findings. But what these psychologists discovered is that, in fact, he was seeing a causal relation that wasn't there. There was indeed a correlation between giving compliments and poor executed next exercises, and between giving punishments and better executed next exercises. But it's not the compliments and the punishments that cause the performance in the next exercise. It's just a statistical truth that after we have an exceptionally well executed exercise, the chances that you'll have another exercise by the same student that is as good, that is performed as well or better, are pretty small. And similarly, if you have an exceptionally poorly executed exercise, the chances of that same student executing that exercise in a similarly poor fashion or even worse is also very small. So there's a kind of regression to the mean. You get more normal values, more normal performances in the next rounds. It has nothing to do with you giving compliments or giving them push-ups and scoldings. But we often think it does. We often see causal relations when there aren't any. And the fact that we're so quick to see all kinds of relations and patterns also means that we often see, orders, patterns in completely random series. For instance, if you have people mimic a random series of zeros and ones, they often, without knowing, put patterns in there because they want to change between zeros and ones way too often, so there's patterns getting in there. Interestingly, when you ask them, when you give them, a completely random series, they often see patterns in there that aren't there. So they put, order in randomness, and they see order in randomness. This is the pattern-seeking human being. And Apple discovered that after they brought out their first iPod Shuffle. Now, the first iPod Shuffle would completely randomly, play one song and then another, and it was a completely random series of the songs you had saved on your device. Now, predictably, the pattern-finding, seeking humans that bought those first Apples, well, they discovered all kinds of patterns in there, and they wrote with their complaints to Apple that they discovered this and that pattern, that the series wasn't random at all, when in fact it really was random. So what Apple did is they put all kinds of algorithms in there. Do not play this song after the other song if it has happened in, the last 5-6 hours, for instance, because otherwise people will think there's a pattern here, one comes after the other, and a bunch of rules and algorithms to make it seem like it was random, when in fact it was no longer random. Now, we also see something similar in the analysis of sport events, especially in basketball. Now, in basketball, coaches and reporters often talk about a hot hand. A player that's really high in confidence, that has scored a few baskets, is more likely to score in the future as well. And as I said, basketball games are analyzed in that way. Basketball coaches act on it, so they will never, they will often not pull out a player who has scored a few times recently, because they think, he's in full confidence, he has a hot hand, he will score more, and they will take out players who missed, 2 baskets in a row, for instance, and so forth. Now, this could, of course, be true. Psychology does play an important part in sport performance, but interestingly, statisticians, again, psychologists, statisticians, well, they analyzed an extremely big sample of basketball games, and they found that these alleged patterns of confidence streaks and of players losing confidence and therefore missing more is actually completely non-existent. So statistically, there's no patterns there. So the chances of a player scoring when he has scored in the recent past do actually not increase. But despite all of this, we still analyze games in such a way, and coaches, as I said, still act on it. So typical expression of seeing all kinds of patterns, plausible patterns, but still patterns that aren't there. And we also, when we're faced with extreme coincidences, think this can no longer be a coincidence. And there's a bunch of story there, so we radically underestimate the existence of extreme coincidences. Think, for instance, of the lottery. Well, the chances that you will win the lottery are negligibly small. But the chances that someone will win the lottery are in fact very high. In fact, it's a certainty that at some point somebody will win it. Now, when extreme coincidences occur, as I said, we often tend to think there must be more to the story. this can be a coincidence. But in fact, it is a mathematical certainty that extreme coincidences in a big sample of people will occur regularly. And there's a bunch of examples. There's a French family, Comet, who was killed very sadly and ironically by a comet that crashed into their house, something which happens, not very often, of course. And then there's other stories, and I've got a few in my transcript. I just want to give you one actually a very dark but interesting, crazy coincidence story that has given rise to all kinds of theories and irrational beliefs and so forth. And that is the story about James Dean and his Porsche. And his Porsche, he called that Porsche Little Bastard. And it was actually very aptly named because that Porsche would cause a lot of mayhem. So first of all, James Dean, the famous actor from the 1950s, well, he crashed in that Porsche and he died on the spot. But then when they tried to get, the car back to the garage or something, when they picked up, the wreck of the car, somebody died in that process as well, because he was trying to get the car on the truck or attaching it to the tow truck, and he got killed because he was lying underneath it. Then later on, they would sell parts of that car to other people who wanted a part of James Dean's famous car. So one person bought the motor, which was still fine after the crash, and another person the gearbox and the transmission system and so forth. Anyways, those two people have these parts in their cars. They drive their cars, they both get into horrible accidents. One person is killed, the other one is a paraplegic for life. But it doesn't end there. Then they want the car wreck. They want to get it at an exposition, because if, after all, it's James Dean's car and the car in which he died. One person was very severely injured and perhaps even killed because that car came down during the exposition. It was hung up or something. And then finally they said, well, this car is completely cursed. Let's just get away with it and let's put it in some kind of deposit place far, far away. That's what they did, but actually that place caught flames and everything that was in it was destroyed. So that's the story of the so-called curse of James Dean's car. But obviously these are all a series of extreme coincidences and no good reason to make us believe in supernatural forces and witches and all weird kind of speculations as about who actually did put that curse on James Dean and his car. All right, so in conclusion, when it comes to patterns and causal relations, we have to be very careful. We see many causal relations and we see many patterns that aren't actually there. And when there's actually a causal relation, but we have no clue about what the cause is, think about natural events such as solar eclipses, lightning, thunder in the pre-scientific age. Well, we seem to just make up causes. And then finally, we often misinterpret causal relations. Remember the base rate fallacy example I gave you with the positive test and the chances of suffering of that disease? Well, in that case, we kind of misinterpret the causal relation. We confuse the chances of having the disease with having a positive test with the chances of getting a positive test when you have the disease. And we also see it on a more daily level. For instance, we tend to confuse the chance that somebody is mad at us when she's not picking up the phone with the chance of that person not picking up the phone when she's mad at us. Well, the second is pretty likely. If somebody's mad at us, well, they might very well decide not to pick up the phone. It's therefore not the case that when somebody's not picking up the phone, it is likely that that person will be mad at us. Many other reasons could explain that, for instance, having lost the phone, being very busy, and so forth. We all know this, but still we tend to misinterpret causal relations. And misinterpreting causal relations also has an important role to play in many conspiracy theories. And these conspiracy theories, they're particularly interesting because they bring together a host of reasoning errors. Conspiracy theories like a theory that man never landed on the moon and that Neil Armstrong's first small step and giant leap for mankind was actually taken in a Hollywood basement, or that 9/11 was completely staged and organized by Bush and his administration, or more recently in the corona times that Bill Gates spread the coronavirus to then make billions on a vaccine, or that they will put microchips in those vaccines to control all of us and to control us like puppeteers. Anyways, all of these conspiracy theories, the one more wildly out there than the other, share a number of important factors and play into certain kind of reasoning errors. And the first, as I said, is our causal reasoning errors. Often there's a kind of causal reasoning error at the basis of conspiracy theories. For instance, take the 9/11 conspiracy theory that the Bush administration kind of staged and organized 9/11. Well, the typical argument there is that, well, Bush and his administration, they wanted to invade Iraq. But they couldn't really do so, so they were looking for a reason. And 9/11 actually gave them that possibility. So 9/11 led to the possibility of invading Iraq, because that was, how it played out. Bush wanted to invade Iraq all along, so Bush must have been responsible for 9/11. But of course, the fact that something is politically recuperated, as they definitely did with 9/11, the American government, doesn't mean it has been staged by the people in power. But more importantly, when it comes to conspiracy theories and the way they develop and the way they grow, if you will, are these other biases. First of all, there's, of course, how can it not be there? There's or confirmation bias, the mother of all biases. So conspiracy theories will especially will actually only focus on these kind of findings and these little pieces of information they collect that kind of support their conspiracy theories, and they will completely be oblivious to all of the information, however convincing, however much of that information is around, that could put their theory to doubt, that could deny their claims and so forth. So all counter evidence is selectively weeded out, and all confirming evidence, confirming pieces of evidence are grasped, are remembered, are passed on, and so forth. Then there's also a very strong in-group, out-group biases. These conspiracy theories, they thrive on the internet, in which you have forums, and only like-minded people are allowed in those forums. People actually criticizing them, well, they're kicked out very quickly. And sometimes they even convene, physically. For instance, the 9/11 conspiracy theory movement, the so-called truthers, well, they actually have these major conventions in the US. They get together by the thousands, and there they just, talk to each other and have all kind of people giving presentations on the new kind of insights and new kind of evidence for their conspiracy theory. And they take on all that information very easily, very gullibly, without any kind of critical eye. All of the people criticizing their conspiracy theory and putting out the counter evidence and so forth, well, they're considered as part of the out group and they're not listened to. Even more, actually, the harsh criticism they get from the outsiders is often seen by conspiracy theories as confirmation that they're on the right track. Because if you have a conspiracy theory, well, then there are powerful vested forces that have every interest in the world to keep that conspiracy theory from convincing a lot of people. So to keep it small, to keep it marginalized, and therefore you can think that the more criticism you get from the outside world, the more you are on the right track. It's a sign for them that they are on the right track. But actually, conspiracy theories are often easy to debunk. And the way to go is to apply our second rule of thumb of critical thinking is to apply Occam's razor. Now take the 9/11 conspiracy theory, for instance. Now one major argument there is that the towers, when after the crash from the airplanes, that the towers, they implode in a way that is way too controlled and way too quickly. Now, interestingly, on the side, it's not physicists or engineers saying that, who are part of the conspiracy theory. Often people who have no expertise whatsoever in the way towers will implode when there's aircrafts crashing into them. But that aside, let us just go along with the theory and with the reasoning. So what they argue is that actually there were bombs on the insides of the WTC buildings, and that after they were hit by the airplanes, these bombs were detonated, and this brought the whole building down in a controlled fashion. And they analyze all sorts of videos and so forth to support their claim. So let's go along with that. Okay, so according to them, it's the Bush administration that placed those bombs on the inside of those buildings and then detonated those buildings. Okay, so if we go along with that, well, we must ask ourselves the important question, okay, who placed those bombs there? Presumably, it's not going to be George W. Bush all by himself with a big backpack full of bombs the night before 9/11 in those huge buildings, putting bombs everywhere. Now, for an operation like that, you'd need, a few hundreds of special op forces, military people who place those bombs there. But then we have to ask ourselves, so there must be at least, a few hundreds of people who are in on the 9/11 conspiracy before it happens and know that this disaster will happen in New York on that day and many people will die. Now, in times of whistleblowers, it is extremely unlikely that nobody talked about this. It is even more unlikely that none of these people actually warned outside people who might be living in New York, especially since most people living in the US know a person at least in the second degree, so a friend of a friend who died in 9/11, and know many more people who could have died in 9/11. So you'd imagine in such a case that those American soldiers, well, they would want to warn, cousins, nephews, friends living in New York and so forth, even if they recruit them from the Deep South, for instance. I mean, the world is pretty connected, so they would have known people who might be there and who might die, and probably they would have wanted to warn them. None of this actually happened. So again, if we think it in this kind of way, the 9/11 conspiracy theory raises all kinds of questions, which again require an answer, which seems more and more unlikely. So if we go along with Occam's razor, we see that the theory doesn't stand on its own and that it quickly loses a lot of likeliness. But the reason that these theories do stand strong and that more and more and lots of people believe in that and that they are not quite easily debunked, or that at least the people holding these views do not see these obvious falsifying evidence, is because they want to protect themselves and their theories against criticism, against falsifying evidence. And this lack of a self-critical dynamic is also present in the so-called pseudosciences. Now, pseudosciences are a bunch of theories or practices that look like scientific theories or scientific practices, but in fact do not deserve this quality label. And making the distinction between legitimate science, good science, and pseudoscience is something that philosophers and scientists have been trying to do for a long time. So Aristotle, the old Greek philosopher, already made a distinction between science and pseudoscience, or good and bad knowledge, and he argued that, well, science was a true causal account of phenomena, whereas pseudosciences just advanced unfounded opinions. But this criterion is both too strong. Many very good scientific theories are not completely true. I mean, they're up for revision, at least parts of them are up for revisions, and it's also completely useless. I mean, it's only with hindsight, perhaps, that we can say that the theory was not a true account, but in the moment itself, it's very hard to say, right? And so one very influential criterion, demarcation criterion as they call it, to distinguish science from pseudoscience, came from the man you see on this picture, came from Karl Popper in the 20th century. And his criterion was a criterion of falsifiability. In order to distinguish science from pseudosciences, we must actually look at the theories and the claims they make. And according to Popper, scientific theories, scientific hypotheses are falsifiable. What does he mean by that? That there could, in principle, this is not sure it will happen, but in principle, there could be observations that would reject, that would falsify the hypothesis or the theory. Pseudosciences, on the other hand, according to Popper, do not make these kind of claims, do not have these kind of hypotheses which could be tested, which could be potentially falsified by making certain kind of observations. So the interesting thing about Popper's criterion is that he kind of turns everything around. So it's not the certainty we have of a theory being right that makes a theory scientific, as was often assumed before, but it's actually the fallibility of that theory. It's the chance of that theory being wrong that makes that theory scientific. And as you can imagine, that protected against the mother of all biases, and that is the confirmation bias. So Popper's falsification criterion asks of scientists to go test their theory, to look for all of the ways in which the theory could be wrong. And that is, according to Popper, what pseudoscientists do not do. They are not testing their hypotheses. They are not making hypotheses which could be tested in the first place. And what gave Popper this insights were two extremely influential scientific breakthroughs theories of his time. And one is Freud's psychoanalysis. The other one is Einstein's relativity theory. Now, both were extremely revolutionary theories. Freud introduced the working of the subconscious mind in psychology, and Einstein introduced the relativity of time and place in physics. Both also were seen as very successful. Freud could explain all kinds of psychopathological syndromes, and Einstein could explain everything Newton could explain with his theory in the physical world, and even could explain those things that Newton could not, the anomalies that crept up in Newton's system. So we're seen as extremely successful theories. But according to Popper, there was one major and crucial difference between the two theories. And that is that whereas Freud had a whole bunch of hypotheses about the working of the subconscious mind, none of these hypotheses, nothing in his theories could actually be falsified. Why? Because all kinds of human behavior would be able to be explained, would be explainable in terms of his theoretical concepts. Einstein, on the other hand, made very precise predictions which could be tested. For instance, Einstein predicted that light from stars will be deflected by the mass of the sun, and that we could observe something like that during an eclipse. And that is what happened a few years after he came with his theory. Eddington, another physicist, would observe this deflection when there was an eclipse, and this astounded the whole world because it was something nobody believed would actually happen. So a very strong test. If Eddington would have observed that starlight was not deflected by the mass of the sun, well, Einstein's theory would have been refuted. Later on, they would keep on testing Einstein's theory, for instance, by putting an atomic clock and having it run a course around the world at a very high speed around the Earth. And they saw that, as Einstein predicted again, there was a small deflection of time. And then finally, today they're still testing Einstein in the CERN in Switzerland, where the particle accelerator is. If there's a particle there that would travel at a speed that is faster than the speed of light, then again Einstein's theory would be refuted. So from Einstein's theory, a bunch of very concrete predictions followed that could be tested. This wasn't the case for Freud's theory. In fact, in the 1960s, I believe, there was psychoanalysis was still extremely popular. It still is to a certain extent today. And there was this philosopher of science, Sidney Hook, who was really convinced of the value of Popper's criterion, who went to that conference. And to a room filled to the brim with psychoanalysts, he asked the following question. He asked them, well, please tell me what kind of a behavior a child would need to exhibit for it not to suffer from the Oedipus complex. The room remained completely silent. Nobody had thought about that. Nobody had thought about possible falsifying information for their hypotheses. Does that mean that good scientists, that they have no confirmation bias, or that they're able to completely control their confirmation bias, and that they diligently always and only will look at possible falsifying information? Well, of course not. Scientists are humans, and like all humans, they have a very strong confirmation bias. Perhaps even more than some humans, because scientists, they also compete with one another and they want their hypothesis to be true. They would give a lot for their hypothesis to be true, and so they will do everything, quite often they will do a lot to support their hypothesis, to bring, not falsifying information to the fore, but actually to try to support their hypothesis with all this kind of confirming evidence they can find, confirming arguments they can find. But what is the difference with pseudoscience is that the scientific context protects for the confirmation bias of the individual scientist. That scientific context, or that culture in which science is done, well, is one of merciless criticism of the theories of others, and this is the best protection mechanism you can get against the confirmation bias. In fact, in such a context, the confirmation bias might even be a good thing, because then scientists are dishing up all of the arguments, all of the evidence in favor of their own hypothesis, and all of the criticism, which also scientists are very motivated to do, the criticism from rivaling scientists, from rivaling research groups, well, is dished up by these other scientists and groups. And so the way science is structured allows for a pretty decent protection against this confirmation bias. Think also of the review process, and we'll talk a bit more about all of this in the last lecture. The review process, before a scientist can publish his or her findings, well, his article, where he outlines all of his findings and the way he interpreted these findings and so forth, will first be sent to colleagues completely anonymously, and they will criticize that article if there's anything lacking, missing, wrong interpretations and so forth. And the scientist has to respond to all of these criticisms before his work or her work can be published. So a culture of merciless criticism by other scientists protects against the confirmation bias of the individual scientists. And this, as I pointed out, is not the case in the pseudosciences. In the pseudosciences, well, people are often going to protect themselves against criticism, and there's different ways of doing that. One way is by setting up moving targets. Now, a good example of that, again, comes from Freud and psychoanalysis. Now, according to Freud psychoanalysis, neurotic disorders, well, they were caused by a frustration of the libido, as they call it, so by sexual frustration, if you will. Now, he had this theory before the First World War. Then the First World War erupted, and many soldiers came back from that First World War and from the horrors of that First World War with what they call the shell shock phenomenon, with very strong neurotic disorders. And evidently those were they were caused by the horrors they had to endure in the war. Today we call this PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and it's a very well-known psychopathology. Now, interestingly, you would think, well, that's the end of Freud's theory about neurosis, right? So there's an obvious example here of instance here of neurotic disorders being caused not by some kind of sexual frustration, but by just experiencing extreme anxiety and horror during the war. You'd think Freud would therefore discard his theory. There was strong falsifying evidence against at least this hypothesis, but this is not what Freud did. In fact, what he did was move his targets so he could deal with the criticism, hence the words moving targets. So what he did is he would radically reinterpret his own libido theory of neurosis in order for it to be able to deal with that strong counter evidence. So he would reinterpret it in the following terms. He would say, well, those soldiers, they were actually being threatened in their most cherished love object. And that most cherished love object was their own body. So because they were threatened in their own body, their most cherished love object, they developed these neurotic disorders. So it's very much still a frustration of the libido, but it's completely and radically interpreted in an extremely different way. So it's very clear from Freud's earlier writing that he meant, sexual frustration and libido as some kind of attraction force to other people, not your own body, but he radically reinterpreted just to save his theory. Now, a second way to protect a theory against falsifying evidence, possibly falsifying evidence, is to build in enough vagueness. If you remain very vague about what to expect, well, obviously it's much harder to falsify that hypothesis. Think, for instance, of all kinds of alternative therapies, such as chakra stimulation. Well, it's always pretty vague what exactly the patient should expect of these theories, how exactly it's going to work. So when after stimulating the chakras, there's not much improvement at first. That is easily explained by saying, well, your chakras are blocked even a bit more on a deeper level. We should keep going. And in the end, often people get better spontaneously, and then that is chalk one up for the therapy. And so the therapy is not really subjected to a lot of testing, a lot of criticism. And this brings me to the domain where pseudosciences find the most fertile ground, where the most pseudosciences are located, and that is not a coincidence. And that domain is healthcare. Now, in healthcare, there's three important elements that create a perfect storm, as I call it here. And because of that, therapy experience is exceptionally unreliable. That means that a lot of people giving certain kind of therapies will be very convinced that their therapies are working really well. Homeopathy, acupuncture, you name it. But actually, these three important reasons explain why that therapy experience, the experience that the person giving the therapy has with that particular therapy, is particularly unreliable. And that is also why there are so many bogus therapies in healthcare. And the first element is the important placebo effect. Now, as I'm sure you have heard of, the placebo effect means that when somebody believes that a therapy will help him or her, that positive psychological expectation has a good effect on the healing process. So people will get rid of, you could say, a headache, for instance, when they get a sugar pill, just because they believe that it will get rid of their headache. Then the second one of course, is our confirmation bias. The person giving the therapy, well, will be subjected to a strong confirmation bias, and so will be much more attuned to all of the confirming evidence than everything that could disconfirm, that could reject the fact that the therapy is working. And then finally, there's the issue of spontaneous healing. Most diseases, all diseases that are not chronic or terminal, well, they get better over time. And so there's also this spontaneous healing process. And so it's very hard to say that people got better because of the therapy or just because time healed their afflictions. And very often the argument is given that, well, they've been doing this therapy for over 1,000 years in China or in India, so there must be something to it. This too is a very wrong-headed argument. Because of the placebo effect, the confirmation bias, and spontaneous healings, people have been, and healers have been giving certain kind of therapies for centuries on end, and in good faith believed that these therapies were very efficient in healing people, when in fact they were not. Even more so, there have been therapies that have been around for a very long time that weren't only not doing anything positive for the patients, but actually were very dangerous for that patient. Good example of that is bloodletting. Now, bloodletting was used for all kinds of afflictions, and the ancient Greeks already did it more than 2,000 years ago, and they were still doing it in the 19th century. And as I said, they did it for a whole range of symptoms. They would just tap some blood, take out sometimes more than a liter of blood to heal these afflictions. Now, today we know that bloodletting is not only completely useless for all of these diseases to which it was applied, but even more so, it is actually very dangerous. If you're going to, take out a liter of blood in a patient that's already sick, that's already weakened, well, you're not improving his chances of survival. In fact, autopsy on people who died centuries ago, well, often reveals that the cause of death is not whatever they were treated for, but the cause of death is often the bloodletting they received for their afflictions. For instance, George Washington, the first president of the United States, most probably died of bloodletting, not for the laryngitis for which he was, like an infection of the throat, for which he was actually tried to be cured, for which the bloodletting happened. We have to remember in this context that scientific thinking, critical thinking in general, is also an autonomous form of thinking. So just relying on tradition is not what we should be doing. So how should scientists proceed? How should we test whether a therapy or medication actually works? So this is a very important question to answer, and there's a very important protocol developed in science to be able to deal with that perfect storm and to make sure that these three elements, the placebo effect, the confirmation bias, and spontaneous healing, are not distorting our interpretation of whether or not a therapy works. And that protocol is randomized double-blind trials with control groups. Now, all of these words are important. So first of all, what's a control group? A control group is a group of people who receive a placebo treatment or medication instead of the real thing. So let us say we're trying to test new medication for diabetes. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to, first of all, get a lot of diabetic patients, and then we're going to divide those patients in two groups. The group who gets the medication, the group who gets a placebo medication. That's the only way to be able to say that the medication works more than just by giving a placebo effect, works more than the placebo treatment. Second important term here is the fact that it is randomized. That means that the patients will be divided over those two groups in a completely random fashion. Otherwise, there could be a strong selection bias. The researcher might put the more hopeful cases in the therapy group and the more hopeless cases in the control group. Even unconsciously, that this could happen and could really distort the results. So it must be randomized. And then finally, and most importantly in the context of the confirmation bias, these trials are double-blind. What do they mean with double-blind trials? Well, first of all, the patients themselves obviously do not know whether they're in the control group, the placebo group, or in the therapy group. Otherwise, the placebo effect would kind of vanish for the people in the placebo group. But also, the researchers studying this medication cannot know which patient is in which groups. So it's people doing the admin for the whole experiment, for the whole trial, as they call it, that will keep tabs on who is in which group. But while the research is ongoing and while the researchers are actually studying how the patients are doing, well, they cannot know whether the patient is on the placebo or on the real medication. If they do know which patient is in which group, well, they are pretty biased and they greatly overestimate the effectiveness of this new medication. So very important protocol to protect against all of these biasing factors and actually scientifically test whether a therapy or medication actually works. Randomized double-blind trials with control groups. And then we're on to a very different domain of irrationality, and a kind of domain that is very peculiar when you analyze it from an evolutionary perspective, and that is religion, or just the domain of supernatural beliefs. And it's peculiar because on the one hand, religion is a universal human feature, if you will. That means that all human societies throughout history, as far as we know, have possessed religious beliefs. Now, if we discover new tribes hidden in the Amazonian forest and we contact them for the first time, we can almost assume that they will have two things. They will have language and they will have religious beliefs with certain kind of rituals. So it's kind of this domain of irrationality that all human groups have and have had throughout history. And this is especially peculiar because many of those religious beliefs come with behaviors that do not promote survival and reproduction. Sometimes it's economic costs that are being paid, giving offerings to the gods. Other times it is even reproductive chances that are being forsaken because of religious beliefs. Think about celibacy of priests and so forth. And then there's also all sorts of rituals which do not enhance chances of survival and reproduction, like fasting and like the more extreme rituals that are sometimes part of religious beliefs and religious cultures, like for instance this picture of people in the Philippines putting themselves on a cross for a day on Easter to commemorate Christ's passion. Now, evolutionary, this is kind of baffling because the question arises, well, how could these kind of beliefs and this disposition to have these supernatural beliefs have evolved if they do not help people survive and reproduce? And scientists have taken on the challenge to explain the cognitive foundations of supernatural beliefs. And they do so in the so-called cognitive science of religion. This is a relatively new area of investigation, of scientific inquiry, some 30, 40 years old. And psychologists, cognitive psychologists have discovered, or at least have hypothesized, about a number of important psychological features that lead naturally to supernatural beliefs, that lead spontaneously to supernatural beliefs. And the first is the so-called hyperactive agency detection. We've talked about it in the last lecture under error management. Remember our ancestor that was looking at the bush there was rustling in that bush, he saw some movement, and he could make two mistakes. He could think it's a predator when in fact it was just the wind and just run away for no reason. Not a very bad mistake. Or he could make the opposite mistake, think, oh, it's just the wind, when in fact it was a predator ready to eat him. Well, making that first mistake is not as costly a mistake, so we're wired to make more of the first mistakes. So we're wired to actually detect the actions of agents, and agents are other beings with intentions behind all sorts of natural events. And according to these cognitive scientists of religion, this plays an important role in the emergence of supernatural beliefs. Because especially in a pre-scientific age, well, many of those natural phenomena, and we've talked about it, like causal eclipses, thunder, lightning, and so forth, well, they were invariably, almost always seen as an expression of, as the action of some kind of god or supernatural being. Again, they were seen as the actions of an agent, and so those were to become those supernatural agents. Then secondly, there's also a strong intuitive dualism that leads to supernatural beliefs. What is an intuitive dualism? Well, it's a strong distinction between the mental, the mind, and the body or the material world. So we make a strong distinction because we have very different intuitions to, for instance, predict the behavior of other people with minds. If somebody's acting in a certain way, and they call this a theory of mind, well, I'm going to assume that that person acts that way because he or she has certain beliefs, he or she has certain desires, intentions, and so forth. Now that makes a lot of sense, and that works really well to predict how other people are behaving. Of course, we're not applying these intuitions when we see a rock, roll down from a slope. There we're thinking in mechanistic terms, and we have very different intuitions to actually predict how entities in the physical world, in the material world, are going to behave. Now, because of this, we seem to make a very strong distinction between the mental and the material. And even in our day and age where neuroscientists are making closer and closer links between mental activity and actual physical processes in the brain, still we're tempted to make a very strong distinction here. And from this very strong distinction, it's a quick step to actually hypothesize about the fact that our mind or mental existence would be something that is not mortal like substances, like our bodies, so could survive, our mortal body existence. And more importantly, from this, we can, and so that leads us to believe that our ancestors are still around, that will still be around, after our death in some form or another. But also more importantly, it also quickly leads us to assume that there might be beings who are purely mental and not material at all, like ghosts and gods. And we see that these kind of creatures, these kind of entities hypothesized in almost all religious supernatural systems across the world and throughout history. And then there's also another important factor that might contribute to supernatural beliefs and religions, and that is called the so-called preference for teleofunctional explanations. And those are explanations in terms of purposes and functions. Now, a very interesting experiment, or at least, questionnaire was set up by psychologists. And they asked children, but also they've replicated that. They've also asked adults who had no scientific background whatsoever, so in illiterate populations. So they asked them the following question. Now, why do you think certain rocks are pointy? And they had two options. First option was just purely coincidence, or because the wind shaped it that way and so forth, so mechanical forces. Or second option, because big animals such as elephants would not sit on them and crush them. Now, interestingly, invariably, children and adults with no scientific background will prefer the second explanation. They think the second explanation will be more likely. So rocks are pointy so that big animals will not sit on them. This is something that seems plausible to our intuitive mind, at least when we haven't been taught differently by science. And so from there you can see the pool of creation stories in which, a divine being designed the world and everything was designed for a certain purpose. That seems to be our default assumption about the world. And again, we find these creation stories throughout history in all societies. And then finally, when these religious beliefs take hold, well, they spread very easily in those societies, in those groups, because we teach our children these beliefs. And so the in-group, out-group bias has an important function here. We take on these beliefs, very uncritically. This is also the reason why, almost everybody keeps the religion he or she was taught at a young age. Doesn't shift. You don't see that many Christians becoming a Muslim or Muslims becoming Christians. The in-group, out-group bias has an important role there too. We take on the beliefs from the people that are in our close environment, and we take those on pretty uncritically. Where it concerns beliefs from very different other groups, well, we are very critical and we often do not take on these beliefs. But so from our own group, we take on pretty irrational beliefs pretty easily. But we do not only err in higher spheres, we also err in our day-to-day lives. And in the last decades, behavioral economists, which are psychologists and economists working together and studying the behavior of consumers and of investors, have discovered that the assumption that economic actors are rational actors, that is the assumption of classical economics, is actually by and large a myth. The way we take decisions, be it as a consumer or as an investor, is not only irrational, but as Dan Ariely calls it, is predictably irrational. We all have the same kind of biases and we all use the same kind of shortcuts to come to certain kind of decisions. A good example is the price we're willing to pay for a certain product. Now, in classical economics, you assume that people are going to purchase a certain good when they can get a certain amount of utility or use or happiness from purchasing that product, and that the use they get out of that purchase cannot be rivaled, or at least cannot be exceeded by other purchases for a similar amount of money. Otherwise, they would have purchased something else. Now, obviously, making those kind of utility calculations is a sheer impossible feat. How much are you willing to pay for a house compared to how many breads it would give you over a lifetime, or how many cars it could give you, and so forth. What we actually do, and so psychologists were very interested in uncovering the real reasons that make us decide to buy something. Apparently what is incredibly important there is what we've discussed in a previous lecture, is anchoring. So what we're willing to pay in terms of price for a certain product has a lot to do with the prices that are in the market for that certain product. So what we're willing to pay are market reasonable prices for products we actually want. And so this has important consequences for new products coming on the market, because for those new products, there aren't any anchors in the market. There's no similar products, so we can't really say, okay, this is priced correctly, reasonably, or not. And so you see that when new products are being brought to the market, well, initially, at least, the consumers are often reticent, are often withholding to buy that product because they don't really feel sure that it's worth its money. A good example of that are these bread machines. They were developed a few decades ago in the United States. And before doing that, they had a whole bunch of market, a whole lot of market, or they did a whole lot of market research. So they're pretty certain that there was a demand for this kind of product. So it's a very easy to use product. You just put on the proper ingredients, you push a button, and 4 hours later or something like that, your bread comes out fully baked, warm, and smelling nicely. So a lot of people wanted that product. At least that's what they thought from market research, and they were probably right in that. But problematically, well, there weren't any prices around. So they had a big marketing campaign, and then they launched their product, and to their surprise and disappointment, that product wasn't really taken up by the consumers. Then a shrewd, psychologist, marketeer, economist, I don't know, a shrewd person who knew about human psychology, well, advised them or said to them, well, the problem here is that people, they do want your product, and actually I think it's priced pretty competitively, but the problem is people don't really have any kind of references, so they're not sure it's worth the price you're asking for it. In order to give them references, what you must do is you must make a deluxe version of your product, just the same kind of basic machine, but then with a few bells and whistles, a bit more decoration, a few other options that nobody will ever use, and you make that product substantially more expensive. Then you must also make a very, very basic version of your product that's not much, but a little bit less expensive than your basic product you want to sell. And then that way, well, people will have an anchor, because there will be other prices in the market for similar kind of products, and predictably they'll buy the best bargain for their money, the product you want to develop on a massive scale, your bread machine, the standard one. And that is what they did, and that is also what happened. So after a year of not really selling, sales picked up massively once they introduced different kinds, and then especially when different brands came on the market. And so there were more and more anchors in the market for such a product. But then there's also a whole bunch of other contexts in which we are irrational. And I want to give you just a last great example of framing. We've discussed framing, the fact that by giving the same relevant information, we get very different kind of decisions, basically just because it's presented in a different way, in a different frame. And so one wonderfully, actually impressive example of successful framing was done by The Economist. The economical journal that comes out, I think, on a weekly basis. And they had, I think back in 2012, they had this big promotion to get more clients. And they gave the option for a yearly subscription. So it was about a yearly subscription, and they gave 3 options. The first option was to have the online version only for $65 a year. Second option was to have the print version for $125 a year. And then the third option was to have the print version and the online version for $125. So people saw it and thought like, okay, sure, fine, but why do you put this absurd second option on there? I mean, who in his right mind is going to choose the paper version only for $125 and not the paper version and the online for $125? Even if you're not using the online, I mean, you're not paying 1 cent more to have the online included. And indeed, nobody picked the online when they got those 3 options. But behavioral economists had studied that, and they had run an experiment which explains the pricing of The Economist. So what they did is they had 2 major groups that were statistically representative, and the first group they gave the pricing options just as I gave them to you now, and as The Economist would do. So they gave the 3 options with the absurd second option. Now when they did so, well, 84% of the people actually chose to have the print and the online, and 16% of the people chose to have the online only. So the great majority picked print and online. Now the other group, they gave just the 2 options, the 2 logical options, online for $65 and print online for $125. Now when the people only had 2 options, then their preferences completely shifted. I think, and I have to look this up quickly while I'm talking, well, when they only had those two options, only 32%, so not even a third of the group, chose print and online, and a whopping 68% chose the online version only. So the story here is most people are kind of hesitating. Everybody likes the print version, it's nicer to read, but you get all the content online as well. So is it worth the extra money? And if you put those two next to each other, then the print and online seems really expensive. It's almost double of the online price, so people pick the online. If you put the three options there, well, then the print and online suddenly becomes very attractive because you seem to get the online for free on top of the print price. And that is what people choose. And so obviously the economists wanted to have as many of the expensive subscriptions, the print subscriptions, because they earn more money that way. And so that is why they gave this absurd second option, and they gave the three options instead of just the two. And there's a whole series of other biases which we have discussed in the tutorial, which you have seen in the tutorial. And also in that first lecture. There's the Allais paradox, there's loss aversion, there's the endowment effect, there's sunk cost fallacy. So more and more kind of biases are being discovered, biases that make the consumer in certain contexts irrational, that also make the investor irrational. As Dan Ariely puts it, well, we're all predictably irrational when it comes to our economic behavior. And as we've seen today, it's not only concerning our economic behavior that we are irrational, there's a whole bunch of domains of irrationality that all normal thinking humans are vulnerable to. And now we've seen why that is the case. Why that can lead to very problematic societal and personal outcomes, we'll discuss in a later lecture on the importance of rationality. Next time, what we'll discuss is the million-dollar question, how we can guard our thinking against these reasoning errors, how we can improve our own thinking. But before that, let us recap quickly with a short summary. So, and again, try to pause the recording and come up with the answers yourself. What are the biases that lead to superstition? Drum roll, hyperactive pattern detection, and the confirmation bias. So we see all kinds of patterns that are in there, and then because of our confirmation bias, we become more and more convinced that there's actually something to it, because we only see confirming evidence. What's the breeding ground for conspiracy theories? Causal reasoning errors. The confirmation bias, as always, the in-group, out-group bias, and the lack of self-criticism. What about pseudosciences? Again, a strong lack and a problematic lack of self-criticism. No self-critical dynamic, protecting theories against falsification, and also the confirmation bias plays a huge role in there, and there can be a number of different biases depending on the particular pseudoscience, but all of those have in common that the confirmation bias really taints, the view of people engaging and proposing these theories. Then what about religion? Hyperactive agency detection, which is a form of error management, intuitive dualism, preference for teleofunctional explanations in terms of purposes and goals, that is. And then finally, very importantly, of course, the in-group, out-group bias. All right, that's it for this lecture. If you're interested in this, if you're interested in pseudosciences, if you're interested in behavioral economics, well, please do look up the following books. A great book on behavioral economics by Dan Ariely, Predictably Irrational, and a very good book on all kinds of pseudosciences, especially in the healthcare sector, by Ben Goldacre, Bad Science. All right, that's it for me. Thank you so much for your attention, and looking forward to see you next time. Bye.